There is always something new waiting just beyond the horizon line, if you are brave enough to look. Join us as we sail into uncharted territory to bring you the best cinematic narratives. Hit subscribe now and follow us toward the next big adventure.
I knew the moment she walked into my kitchen carrying that casserole dish with both hands, and a smile that was just a little too wide. People who genuinely want to help don't announce it with their whole face like that. I've been alive 68 years. I know the difference. Her name was Lizette. My son had married her 14 months before, in a small ceremony out in the garden of a bed and breakfast in Virginia wine country. I wore a cream linen dress and stood in the front row and cried the good kind of tears because I truly believed, that my son had found someone who made him steady. He'd always been a wanderer, my boy. Not aimless, just searching. And when he brought Lizette home the first time, she'd sat at my kitchen table and asked me questions about my herb garden. And I'd thought, yes, she's the one. That was before I understood what she was actually looking for. My husband Aldous had passed 2 years earlier. Pancreatic cancer. 12 weeks from diagnosis to the morning I held his hand and felt it go still. 12 weeks is not enough time to say everything you need to say to a man you've shared 39 years with. And I want you to know that I think about that every single day. Not with bitterness. Just with the particular ache of things left unfinished. What Aldous did leave me, what he spent the last coherent weeks of his life making sure was in order, was security. He was an estate attorney himself, 32 years in practice, and he had watched too many families tear themselves apart over assets that weren't properly protected. He had seen it happen to colleagues, to clients, to a cousin of his, whose children stopped speaking to each other entirely over a fishing cabin in the Adirondacks. So Aldous had been methodical. He restructured everything about 8 years before he died, when a close friend of his had gone through a brutal divorce that nearly cost him the family home. Aldous sat down with his own attorney, someone outside his firm, to keep it clean, and we restructured how we held the house, our investment accounts, and the 2 rental properties we'd accumulated over the years. It was all done properly, documented, filed, legal in every way. When I signed the paperwork, I remember thinking it felt like overkill. We weren't wealthy people. We were comfortable. We'd worked for everything we had. But Aldous said, "Vera, a man who doesn't build a fence until after the neighbor's dog gets into the garden has already lost his tomatoes." I didn't argue with him. I never argued with him about the law. After he passed, I kept living in our house. The same house we'd bought in 1991, a craftsman bungalow on a tree-lined street in a mid-sized city in North Carolina. I kept the garden going. I walked every morning. I had my book club on Thursdays and my friend Genevieve. We've known each other since our children were in diapers, over for coffee on Sundays. I was not withering. I was not confused. I was a widow in her late 60s who was figuring out a quieter version of her life, and that is a different thing entirely. But I suppose from the outside, if you were looking for something specific, you could tell a different story. Lizette started coming around more frequently about 6 months after the wedding. At first, I was glad. My son worked long hours. He's in infrastructures consulting, a lot of travel, and I thought maybe she was lonely during the weeks he was away. She'd stop by with food, which I didn't need but accepted graciously. She'd ask if I needed help with anything around the house. She once offered to drive me to a doctor's appointment, even though I'd been driving myself everywhere without incident for over 4 decades. I thanked her each time. I noticed each time. The first real signal came when she mentioned, very casually, a place she'd driven past on the way to visit a friend in Raleigh, a retirement community. She said the grounds were beautiful. She said they had a pool and a woodworking studio and organized trips to see theater productions. I said, "That sounds lovely for someone who needs it." She laughed a little. "I just thought you might want options, is all." I smiled and changed the subject. A few weeks later, she brought it up again. This time she had a brochure. She'd actually picked up a brochure and brought it to me folded in her purse. She set it on my kitchen table next to the casserole dish she'd carried in with that wide smile, and she said she'd spoken to someone there, and that there was actually a waiting list, and she didn't want me to miss out if it was something I might want in the future. I looked at the brochure. I looked at her. "Lisette," I said, "I'm not on a waiting list for death. I'll let you know when I am." She laughed, but it didn't reach her eyes. I called my son that evening. He was in Denver on a project. I told him what had happened. He sounded uncomfortable in a way I recognized. The way he'd sounded as a teenager when he knew something wasn't quite right but didn't want to be in the middle of it. He said Lizette just worried about me living alone. He said she meant well. I said, I'm sure she does, and I let it go. But I didn't stop watching. 3 months passed. Lizette's visits became less frequent, which I found more interesting than her visits had been. When someone who's been coming around regularly suddenly pulls back, they're usually recalibrating. I've seen it in the law, in relationships, in every human system I've ever been part of. When the pressure pauses, something is usually being prepared. My son flew home for a long weekend in October. We had a good visit, dinner out on Friday, a drive on Saturday morning, a long afternoon at the house where I made biscuits and he ate too many, and we talked about his father the way we do now, gently, with more laughter than tears. Lizette came for dinner on Saturday evening, and she was warm and attentive and perfectly pleasant. I watched her over the rim of my wine glass, and I waited. On Sunday afternoon, after lunch, I was in the garden pulling up the last of the summer herbs when I heard a car pull into the drive. I didn't recognize it. A dark sedan, newer model. My son came out the back door with a look on his face I hadn't seen since his father's diagnosis. Tight. Careful, Lizette came out behind him, and behind Lizette came a man I didn't know. He was carrying a slim leather folder. He was wearing a suit on a Sunday. He had the particular expression of someone who has been briefed in advance. Mom, my son said, we wanted to have a conversation. I took off my gardening gloves. I'd set them on the edge of the raised bed. I had known something was coming, and I had not known exactly what shape it would take, and now I did. All right, I said, come inside. We sat in the living room. Aldous' books were still on the shelves behind me. I had thought many times about rearranging them, but I hadn't. Not yet. The man introduced himself. He was an attorney. I did not recognize his firm. He said he was there on behalf of my son and daughter-in-law, who had some concerns they wanted to discuss with me. He said it in the tone people use when they want to sound reasonable while doing something that isn't. My son wouldn't look at me directly. I want you to understand that. The whole time, he stared at a point slightly to the left of my face, and I had the thought, the very clear thought, that Lizette had worked on him for a long time to get him to this table. The attorney said the word I'd been half expecting. Conservatorship. He said they were concerned about my ability to manage my affairs independently. He said they were not looking to be adversarial. He said they simply wanted to make sure that I had support, that my assets were being overseen properly, that decisions about my care and finances were being made with guidance from people who loved me. He said it all the way a person says something when they have practiced saying it. I let him finish. I didn't interrupt. I didn't shift in my seat. I didn't let my face do anything I hadn't decided it should do. This is something Aldous used to say about negotiation. The person who reacts first loses information about themselves that they can never get back. When the attorney finished, I said, which assets, specifically, are you proposing the conservatorship would cover? He blinked. He'd been expecting tears or protest or confusion, not a follow-up question delivered in a level voice. Well, he said, the primary residence, of course. Any investment accounts. Any property held in your name. I see, I said. My son said, Mom, we just think. I heard what you think, I said quietly. Not unkindly. I looked at him for a long moment. He was 41 years old. I had raised him by myself for 4 years before Aldous came into our lives. And Aldous had loved him like his own. And somewhere along the way, my son had ended up sitting across from me in my own living room with a lawyer, not meeting my eyes. I turned back to the attorney. I'd like to ask you something, I said, as a professional courtesy, since you've come to my home on a Sunday. He nodded. Are you aware, I said, of the legal implications of pursuing conservatorship over assets that are not, in point of fact, held in the name of the proposed conservatee? A pause. I'm sorry, he said. The house, I said, has not been in my name, not solely in my name, not jointly, not in any direct personal capacity for 8 years. It is held by an LLC. My husband established it. I am a managing member. The same is true of the investment accounts you're referencing, which are held in a family trust that was irrevocably structured before my husband's death. The rental properties transferred into a separate vehicle at the same time. I kept my voice conversational. I kept my hands still in my lap. There is nothing in my personal name, I said. That would be subject to a conservatorship proceeding. The entities that hold my assets have their own governance documents, their own legal structure, and their own provisions for what happens in various circumstances. Including, I can tell you, the circumstance of someone attempting to override my role in them through outside legal action. The attorney opened his leather folder. He looked at it for a moment. He closed it. Mrs., he started. I'm not finished, I said. He stopped. I want to be clear about something, I said. I am 68 years old. I walk 2 miles every morning. I manage my own finances, my own property, my own correspondence, my own medical care, and my own garden. I have not given anyone reason to believe otherwise, because there is no reason to believe otherwise. What has happened here today is not about my welfare. I think we all know that. I looked at Lisette when I said it. She had been very quiet since we sat down. She was looking at a place just above my left shoulder. Now, I said to the attorney, is there anything else you'd like to discuss? He said there wasn't. He said he appreciated my time. He gathered his folder and he stood up and he was out the front door in under 4 minutes. I watched him go from the window. My son hadn't moved. When the car pulled out of the driveway, he said, Mom, not today, I said. Go home. Think about what happened here today. When you're ready to have an honest conversation, you know where I am. Lisette stood up. She straightened her jacket. She looked at me, and for just a moment I saw something cross her face that wasn't quite shame, but was related to it. I really did think, she said, that you might need. Lisette, I said, you walked into my home with a lawyer to try to take legal control of what I own. Please don't tell me what you thought. She left. My son followed her, pausing at the door with his hand on the frame and his back to me for a long moment before he walked out. I stood in my living room and listened to the car leave. Then I went back to the garden. The rosemary still needed cutting. The afternoon light was still good. The birds were still doing whatever birds do in October when they sense the cold coming, but it hasn't arrived yet. That particular busy energy of things being prepared. I cut the rosemary. I put it in my basket. I went inside and washed my hands at the kitchen sink and looked out at the yard I had tended for 30 years. The LLC documents were in the fireproof box in the second bedroom, where Aldous had put them and where they had stayed. I had never moved them, because there had never been a reason to. They had sat there, patient and invisible, the way a fence sits there, doing its job without being thought about. I thought about Aldous. I thought about the last lucid conversation we'd had about 10 days before the end. He'd asked me if I understood the structure of everything, the LLC, the trust, the way the provisions worked. I said I did. He said he needed me to understand it because he wasn't going to be there to explain it, and I needed to be able to speak to it clearly if it ever came up. I said, why would it come up? He said, because you're going to be a woman alone with assets in a world where some people see that as an opportunity. I need you to be able to say exactly what you have and exactly how it's held and not flinch when someone pushes back. I had told him he was being dramatic. He wasn't. My son called me 11 days later. He called on a Tuesday morning, which was significant because he almost never calls before noon. He asked if he could come see me. I said yes. He came alone. He sat at my kitchen table in the chair he'd sat in his whole life, and he told me that Lisette had been talking about the house since shortly after the wedding. That she'd asked him more than once what it was worth. That she had been the one to research the attorney, to lay out the plan, to convince him. And this is the part that cost him something to say. That I was struggling in ways he needed to take seriously. He said he'd let himself believe it because it was easier than questioning her. I put my hand over his on the table. He's still my son. He's going to have to live with what he sat across from me and let happen, and that is its own consequence, and I don't need to add to it. I told him the truth, that his father had made sure I would never be vulnerable to exactly this kind of thing, that Aldous had been, in the end, still protecting me even years after he was gone. My son put his head down and was quiet for a long time. Before he left, he asked me why I'd never told Lisette, or him, about the LLC, about the trust, about any of it. I thought about that for a moment. Because it wasn't her business, I said. And because your father always said you only show your hand when you have to. I had to, and I did. I don't know what happens with his marriage. That's between the two of them and whatever honesty they can find or can't. I hope for him that she's able to account for what she did. I hope for him that he's able to ask the hard questions. I made peace with what I could control a long time ago. The brochure for that retirement community is still on my kitchen counter. I never threw it away. I put it there the morning after the Sunday in my living room, and sometimes I look at it when I'm making coffee, not because I'm considering it. I am not considering it, but because it reminds me that Aldous was right. About the fence, about the tomatoes, about building the thing before you need it, and keeping quiet about it until the moment comes when silence stops being useful. I am 68 years old. I know my own name. I know what I own and how I hold it and what it means and what it doesn't. The garden is going to be beautiful again come spring. I know that too.